Sikkim 365 and Baylor Plus have teamed up to bring Baylor fans the ultimate content bundle. You can sign up now for $17.99 a month, a $5 monthly savings, and get instant access to all premium content on both websites. For more information, visit either sikkim365.com or baylorplus.com today. What's up, Baylor family? Welcome into Inside Baylor Sports, the official daily podcast of Baylor Athletics. It's Tuesday, October 7th. With it being Baylor's first off week of the season, Grace and I felt it was appropriate to kind of go back and look at, recap what Baylor did in the first half, first 6 games, but also really just look forward to what's coming up, coming down the pipe for Baylor after their off week. Grayson, we know Baylor's 2-4, and the Iowa State game got away from them, and really, to me personally, kind of like reset expectations because you play a couple of close games against Colorado, BYU, and you're still feeling like, man, this team's going to turn a corner at some point. Is it possible? Halfway through the Iowa State game, still feeling the same way. You're like, man, this is kind of where we were hoping Baylor would be. Now, can they win this game? And then it just snowballed in Iowa State's favor. You get those on the road a lot against good teams. When your team is struggling, you find that a lot happening. But I think what we can ultimately agree on after the first half of the season is that Baylor has faced, to this point, what was the tougher half of their schedule. I mean, talk about Utah, now ranked number 16th, and that game was with a half a game with Utah having Cam Rising. Colorado, who has exceeded expectations in a lot of ways. They're not ranked, but they're 4-1, beat kind of a dark horse favorite in UCF, really just took them to the woodshed in a lot of ways. Then obviously BYU, no one really saw this one coming. They're now 5-0, ranked number 14 in the country. And then Iowa State, number 11, 5-0, and ultimately look like, to me, after seeing Utah, BYU, Colorado, kind of the upper echelon of the league right now outside of Texas Tech, who's Baylor's coming up next. Iowa State, to me, looks like the team that is going to contend for the playoff spot and ultimately the college or the Big 12 championship. So we knew what we were getting with Utah, Iowa State. Colorado, BYU have exceeded expectations, and now Baylor's 2-4 first half of the season, and they have an uphill battle to get to bowl eligibility with Dave Aranda this year.
That's the tough part is you kind of looked at the schedule and you said Utah and Iowa State are probably going to be losses, especially with those coming on the road and tough places to play. But then you kind of move forward and you go, okay, they should be Tarleton State. Air Force should be a win. I know there were a lot of people pessimistic about that game before the season, but I think it was pretty clear that Air Force was going to take a step back this year, and they clearly have, and Baylor took advantage of that. But then the 2 swing games, just really unfortunate how both of those games played out against Colorado and BYU. I thought Baylor would beat both of them coming into the season, but I also thought Colorado would be a 6-6 team and BYU would be like a 4-8 team. So obviously very off on kind of my expectations, especially for BYU. Baylor loses both of those. And now you're seeing at a point where, yes, the first half of the schedule was tougher, but I would also say that the second half of the schedule is filled with your more natural rivals. And that's going to make things really, really interesting as you go forward, because sure, yeah, maybe these teams aren't, as good as the first half of the schedule, but these teams want to beat you a whole lot more than those other teams did. And so that's also going to, I think, ramp things up for both sides, Baylor's side and the opponent that they're going to be facing. So very curious about kind of how that all plays out. We kind of knew that coming into the year, but I think we all pretty much felt like outside of Utah and Iowa State that the back half of the season was going to be the toughest part, and that Baylor would have to get off to a 4-2 start probably in order to make a bowl game. But now with how bad the back of the schedule is, if Baylor can kind of weather the storm per se, then maybe they can turn things around. But it still is a lot to ask. I mean, when you're talking about a team, going 4-2 the rest of the way, that's not easy.
Yeah, no, it's not. And you don't want to be in a situation where you're facing a bunch of teams that with their backs up against the wall while your back's up against the wall. And Baylor went into the Iowa State game kind of in that mentality, but you knew it was going to be a tough atmosphere, right? Like, you're playing in names, night game, national television. They're going to be amped up, wide out, all the numbers that you could imagine. That's what Iowa State had going for them in that game. And then it snowballed on Baylor. So It wasn't expected to be a win, but it's like one of those opportunities to continue to be competitive in those games. Maybe you pull an upset, and then it exposed Baylor's in a lot of ways. You look at the defensive side of the ball. So a lot of things in that game just kind of knocked the wind out of the fan base, I would say. For me personally, it's just like, man, like you're that close for 2.5 quarters after playing 2 really competitive games, and then you're not able to at least make it competitive late. But at the end of the day, this seems about getting to 6 wins. Like if you thought otherwise going into the season, it's about getting to 6 wins. Unfortunately, this team could be 4-2, and it's not. It's 2-4. It's complete opposite. And for instance, Baylor's next opponent is now 4-0 in one-scores games with Texas Tech. And I mean, that's what Baylor needed to do early in the season. Granted, I would gladly trade schedules with what Texas Tech has and what Baylor's had, from the aspect of Baylor's trying to build this thing from the ground up ultimately right now. They hit rock bottom last year and they're coming back from it. And if you tell me that Baylor has Arizona State, Arizona to an extent, but Cincinnati, 2 of those games at home, you feel much more comfortable with this where Baylor would be or potentially would be. That's not the hand that they were dealt. And obviously it's put them behind the 8 ball going into the Texas Tech game. You know, Tech fans are going to be absolutely ramped up for this game. 5-1, they're leading the Big 12 3-0. I don't know. Is it a solid 3-0? Like, are they true league contenders? I don't think we know yet. I think they have deficiencies just like all teams. They've just been able to overcome them until this point in the season.
Yeah, that's where Tech has been. And we've talked about they were dealing with injuries at the beginning of the year, and they were able to just overcome them and find ways to win games. And at the end of the day, that's very important. I think currently, according to most metrics, they're kind of in the middle of the pack, but above the average. So pretty much probably like a top 6-ish type range is where I think most metrics would have them. And that makes a lot of sense with where they're at, how they've played so far. They've won football games. That obviously helps with the metrics. So yeah, that's kind of where they are. I think in general, though, I was doing some research on just kind of, who's Baylor played. We keep saying they're really good. The records of these teams are really good, but how good are the teams that they've played? And, according to the metrics, this is an average of the 7 most popular metrics. So it includes SP plus, FEI, Kelly Ford, a lot of different ones, beta. So the top 5 teams in the conference in this order are Iowa State, Kansas State, BYU, West Virginia, and Utah. Those are the top 5 currently, according to the metrics. Utah, obviously, Baylor had to play them with Cam Rising, and I do believe with Cam Rising, that's a top 3 team in the conference. I think it's pretty clear based on what we've seen so far. So, I mean, you look at that, it goes, okay, Baylor's played the number 1 team in the Big 12, the number 3 team in the Big 12, the number 5 team in the Big 12, and then Colorado, who is just behind Texas Tech at number 7 currently, is where their kind of ratings have them averaged out at. So it has been really tough. And then you flip that over to, okay, well, you say that, but then who are they playing in the second half of the year? Well, let me go to the very bottom of the Big 12 and kind of give you an idea of what Baylor has coming up. Houston is 16th. You move up 1, Baylor's at 15. And then you have Kansas, TCU, Arizona State's the bridge, and then Oklahoma State. I mean, it is just so many teams in the bottom half, and not just the bottom half. I mean, we're talking the bottom 6 teams. That's who you're playing in the second half of the season.
Yeah, it's a complete 180 from what I anticipated. And obviously, I think you start with a team like Kansas, who Baylor plays at the very end of the season. A lot of people think Jalen Daniels is back. Their star running backs are back, and they have so many people coming back. Lance Leipold is in, I don't know what season this is, but he seems like he's been there forever now because they just keep kind of chipping away. And they're 1-5, 1-4, and you're just like, 1-5. So you're just, it just kind of epitomizes the whole second half of Baylor's schedule of where those teams are. Houston, I would say, has improved more. They're going to be a tougher challenge defensively. They're showing that they can run the football under Willie Fritz. West Virginia obviously had a massive rushing game against Oklahoma State. Don't know how good Oklahoma State's defense truly is to this point, but we know that they face some pretty good rushing offenses at the same time. So, yeah, I mean, it's just complete 180. But what these particular advanced statistics that you mentioned, and just for anyone that is not really familiar with them that are listening, they kind of project, but they also equate for who have you played, what numbers are being equated. Garbage time possessions aren't necessarily equated into those. So like once the score gets so big, anything after that doesn't really matter until it comes back into that realm. And so these are accounting for all of those particular sets of circumstances. And it's saying that Baylor has played the hardest teams in the Big 12, and what's left are the teams at the bottom. And you said as an average, that's exactly what all of those top analytical, outputs tell us. And so I don't know, that's really kind of a confusing way to say it, but that's what it shows as an eye test. And that's what the advanced analytics are saying. So do we know what Baylor is? I think we have an idea of what their deficiencies are, but we also look at the rest of the schedule and say, all these teams have deficiencies. Can Baylor figure out how to get to 6 wins based on those deficiencies and take advantage of them? And can they continue to improve in a lot of areas that they've shown improvement, just not consistent improvement on?
Right. And I mean, kind of as we go through this schedule, I also think, we've talked about it a little bit with Baylor, but, what's kind of your mindset going into these games? And I think when you get to the end of the year, if we look at Houston and Kansas's upcoming schedule, you could be looking at two teams that their record is really, really bad at the end of the year. And I know Houston has, played well defensively. I guess they still lost by 20 at home to Iowa State. They still have some bad losses on their, record book. I know they've had some close games too, and they beat TCU really bad, but we don't know how good TCU is. I think it's pretty clear TCU's not, at least not very good. They're maybe okay.
They might be a bowl team in my mind.
Maybe.
Right now.
Yeah, that's fine. But Houston went in there and took care of business and created a ton of turnovers and won that game handedly because of that. But I think when you get to the end of year, motivation is going to matter. And I think with Houston having a first-year head coach, maybe they're able to weather that. But also it's like, oh, it's fine. We have momentum. We'll pack it in this year. We'll 3-9, whatever. I think that could be a possibility. Now, on the flip side, that could be a Baylor possibility as well when you get to the end of the year. But what I will say is if Baylor can somehow get into those last 2 games at 4-6, it becomes really interesting because you're probably going to face 2 teams that you absolutely should beat and can beat, and 2 teams that probably aren't going to a bowl game at that point. Like when you play them, they're probably going to know they're not going to a bowl game. And so maybe you're able to find a way to 6-6. Is that impressive? Not really, but winning games is all that kind of matters.
Yeah, it does. In a situation that Baylor is in right now, you look at the path that they took to where they are. And a lot of that was from neglecting NIL to an extent, neglecting the transfer portal to an extent, and it put them behind the 8 ball. So what Baylor did in the offseason, okay, we're going to revamp NIL. We're going to revamp how we approach the transfer portal. And that brought Baylor back up to the standard of, okay, we have older guys on roster where we didn't a year ago. We have guys at key positions that we didn't have a year ago because we didn't address those needs. Baylor's just trying to get their head above the water right now. So 6-6 on the surface, not ideal. Not for where Baylor wants to be ultimately, but 6-6 in the longevity of a Dave Aranda tenure and showing that he can get back to where they're going to win. 6-6 is crucial. And it's unfortunate the way the schedule played out because of that particular fact. But at the end of the day, when you have a league with 16 teams, you're going to have unbalanced schedules. Some teams are playing 5 home games. Some are playing 4 home games in league. That's just going to be the reality. And you should have taken care of business last year. So I do want to kind of go through these games one by one. We kind of given a general overview, but let's start with Tech because it's next. And I think that this is a game, both you and I both said, man, their defense is not good. But it's really interesting because we talk about advanced analytics. Right now, FEI defense for Tech is 23rd. I'm not sure I'm buying them at 23, considering Iowa State's 21. You don't see the same things on film from those, where Texas Tech has improved his rush defense and they take the football away. Iowa State just plays overall solid football. They can take the football away. They can do some of those things, but Texas Tech is saying, okay, we're going to exceed in these 2 areas defensively. But I'm more of the realm of the K4 defensive numbers for Texas Tech, where it has them 82nd. And not that I think there's probably in between somewhere, but that's a huge gap of what this team actually is. And if the games that I have watched are any indicator, their pass defense has been so suspect in giving up explosive plays. Specifically, I'm more of towards the 82 than the 23. I think they have areas where they're stronger, and it just how does those balance out from game to game? But if Baylor's going to win that game, it's going to be because they're scoring points in Lubbock, and their Tech's offense isn't the best, but it's going to be a challenge because they're very balanced and they can run and throw the football.
Right. I think the area that Texas Tech is getting a lot of love is you kind of look at these advanced metrics and you see like defensive adjusted EPA per play. You look into these numbers and it's like, oh, they're not that bad. But it's like, hey, at some point, the results do matter. Giving up 50 points to Abilene Christian is still on your schedule. Giving up 40 to Cincinnati is still on your schedule. And that was in Lubbock. Giving up, 34, I think, to Washington State in a game that Washington State could have named their score and really ran it up on them if they wanted to and didn't. I think that helps things. I also will say, I think they dealt with injuries early in the season and they're getting a little bit healthier, and that has certainly helped things. And for them to come out and really have their best defensive performance of the year on the road in Tucson against Arizona was very impressive. It's so interesting. I know, Jack McKenzie sent this to us, a tweet that was kind of listing, it's like opponent adjusted EPA on offense and defense, and then where teams rank in that. And Tech is in the quarter that you want to be in. And that's super interesting to me. If you look at kind of, it's broken up into quarters, you want to be in the top right quarter of it. And so they're there with all the CFP contenders. That's kind of how you have it listed. And they're in it. The other teams that are in there that aren't technically CFP contenders are, teams like USC, Texas A&M, SMU is in that range, Pitt, Arizona State. All those teams are in that range. And it's kind of like, whoa, some of those teams I don't feel like are very good, but they're still in the range with literally all your CFP contenders: Notre Dame, Tennessee, Washington, Georgia, Penn State, Bama, all of those type of teams. They're in there. The only Big 12 teams that are in that CFP contender group right now are Kansas State and Iowa State. So it gives you an idea. Tech is close to them. They're actually the closest in the Big 12 to being with that group. Very surprising to me. I do not buy their defense at this point in the season, but I do think offensively, they're going to pose a lot of problems for a lot of teams in the Big 12, especially Baylor, because they can run the ball and they can throw the football. And it's going to require Baylor to probably score a lot of points on the road in Lubbock.
Yeah, and a lot of these efficiency numbers come down to what do you do on both sides of the ball in all categories. So for TCU, for instance, they throw the ball a ton, don't run it efficiently. Not that their rankings are terrible, but for instance, FEI offense 34, K Ford offense for TCU is 22nd. I don't consider their offense great. They could throw the ball like crazy. They're a lot like Colorado, for instance, where they're not going to run it a ton, but they're going to throw it a lot. Tech, they're balanced. They can be balanced if they want to. They can milk the clock. And so you can't really just take away one aspect. And so that's what becomes challenging. And that's probably why some of those rankings are a little bit higher. Defensively, I'm with you. I think it was at one point, we know ACU had their best day of the season, truthfully, even with the relative to their schedule against Texas Tech. And then the Cincinnati quarterback, Sorsby, had his best day of the season against their defense, and that was without his top two running backs.
Of his career.
And I think against Arizona, even their quarterback, even though he struggled with, they basically lost that game because of turnovers late. They rallied to get ahead in that game, then gave it up. But I think he still threw for 300 yards in that game. So there's a precedent set there for their defense to give up plays, give up yards and give up points. Baylor has to go and figure out how to do that. I don't want to call this like a must win, but if you win this game, you're one step closer to bowl eligibility. You look at the home games that you have left, you're saying, now you got to win those three, and then you got to figure out to beat one of Tech, one of Houston on the road. I don't think you're beating West Virginia.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I do view this as a must win personally. I know it's easy to say, oh, there's still a path, but I cannot buy into them going 4-1 the rest of the season. That's a tall task for me. And that's why I think this one's a must win because of where it lies in the schedule. Like if you told me that this was Houston on the road, I would call this a must win. Like if it flip-flop with Tech, for instance. And so that's kind of where I'm at with it. And so I think it is that, and especially off of a bye week. And, for me, I think you spend a whole 2 weeks preparing for one opponent after this tough start. And you've kind of been circling it and saying, okay, here's where we turn things around. Here's where we get on a roll to finish the season. You're preaching this over the next 2 weeks. You're saying, hey, this is the first game. This is the start of something different. We're going to turn the luck. We're going to turn the tide. We're going to find ways to make winning plays. That's what makes this so important, because if you put all this time into this game and then lose it, that's where there's a chance where, okay, well, what can we really expect in these next few games, going forward? Is it going to get a little, tricky as far as motivation goes? And so that's a concern for me. And that's why I do kind of view it as a must win.
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of reasons, it can be a must-win. I think Baylor still has a favorable schedule even after that. Winning on the road is tough. Tech's 5-1. They're going to be amped up for that game. I'm hoping that it's going to be a 11 a.m. game. We don't know yet. I don't know if that's coming. I guess that would be coming out today. They might use the to be determined for the networks, but you hope that it's an early game so Tech fans just aren't absolutely crazy, even though they probably still will be for that particular matchup. But we're going to talk a lot about Tech next week, but I do think we need to get through these last games, and that starts the next week for homecoming. After the bye week, you got Tech. Then for homecoming, Baylor plays Oklahoma State. A lot of question marks about Oklahoma State right now. West Virginia I don't know if you watched that game, but that was a bloodbath. Like West Virginia, this is after Kansas State averaged over 8 yards a carry. West Virginia goes out and averages nearly 8 yards a carry again. I think it would have been had they didn't shut it down, but it just like, okay, there's not this pressing need to rush the football. I think it still ended up around 7. Oklahoma State could not stop them. And then on the flip side, Oklahoma State can't run the football. I mean, Ollie Gordon, and it looks like he's injured right now. We don't know the extent of that, how bad it is, but even the announcers are like, maybe Ollie Gordon, who's potential first-round pick, just says, hey, like, this isn't for me this year. Like, I got to think about my future. We don't know what Oklahoma State's going to look like in 3 weeks. I don't know what their schedule exactly looks like, but, man, you talk about a game where if Baylor needs to win, Oklahoma State might come in there limping. Mike Gundy's going to have them motivated, but, like, that team, they're struggling. Now, Baylor doesn't have the rushing offense that West Virginia and Kansas State do, but there's a lot of other issues besides what Oklahoma State faces in their defensive front. They have plenty of injuries over there as well.
So Oklahoma State has a bye week this week, just like Baylor does. And then they get an interesting matchup that next week that they're probably going to lose. They have to go on the road to Provo on a Friday night at 9:15. So good luck with that. And then they play Baylor that next Saturday. So again, like, it sets up pretty well for Baylor to win that game. I mean, it's homecoming. That's one of those games. And really, we're going to talk about, just as these games go, we're going to talk about all of them, but it's very important that you win your home games. Like, Baylor fans have not had much to cheer about.
They need that. Baylor fans need that bad.
Yes. And so you turn into that game, and whether you beat Tech or not, that game, like, that should be one of those games that you're kind of circling as, okay, there's a great opportunity here. Oklahoma State is terrible on defense, so bad. And it's gotten worse as the season has progressed. It's just getting worse and worse. And I'm questioning kind of motivation with Oklahoma State, which is kind of weird because Mike Gundy, normally he has those guys ready to play. They find a way to win 8 games. They find a way. And I'm just not really seeing it right now. And maybe they can take advantage of their schedule because they do have some favorable games. They get Arizona State in Stillwater. They still have TCU and Tech on their schedule. So they have some chances as well. But, I mean, it's that same conversation, right? If they're 3-4 coming into Waco, they're not where they want to be either. And they're in a really tough spot as well. So, yeah, Oklahoma State, bad defensively, should give Baylor a great opportunity to have offensive success, as like most of the schedule. And then also their inability to run the football and then relying on Alan Bowman to win them games. That's not a recipe for success, and something that Baylor should be able to take advantage of in Waco.
Yeah. I'm going to move on to TCU here in a second, but I don't know what that Oklahoma State team could look like coming to Waco, because, like, if they go and get thumped by BYU, Mike Gundy might just say, hey, this is our time to build. If Ollie Gordon says he's hurt, or 2, he says I'm not playing, Mike Gundy just be like, Alan, man, I love you. You've been my quarterback. You led us to almost a Big 12 championship last year, but I've got to look and prepare for the future at this point. And I know that's really early to say that, but there's some paths to that. And now he might not give up on Brennan Presley and those receivers that they have an experienced offensive line, but man, that's just a tough situation to be in. Like, especially if Ollie Gordon says he's out, what direction does Mike Gundy go? I don't want to put it past Mike Gundy, though. Like, I feel like he could have that team turned around. He's done it all the time. There's never been a season where he's just completely checked out. Like, even a couple of years ago after the Big 12 championship, you thought they were struggling like Baylor was, and then they figured it out, and they were back in the Big 12 championship game last year. So interesting. FEI gives Baylor a 44.9 chance, not FEI, excuse me. FPI with ESPN gives Baylor a 44.9% chance of winning that game. Back to Tech, Baylor has a 32.2% chance of winning that game. But moving on, another home game after the Oklahoma State game, TCU, obviously massive rivalry, and is a theme as you get into the latter part of the season. It's which teams are going to be so concerned about themselves they don't even really care about the opponents, because TCU right now they're hurting like Baylor is for a lot of reasons, and their loss to Houston looks worse than anything that Baylor's endured this season. And they've struggled in spots. They can't run the football. They've shown that they've given up a lot of rushing yards. Houston kind of rushed at will on them. Baylor has a 49% chance of winning that game, according to FPI on ESPN. So basically a toss-up game at home. Another game you say, you better figure out how to win that one if you want to get to a bowl game.
Right. And Josh Hoover is an absolute turnover machine. I mean, the guy has some moments where you're like, wow, this might be the best quarterback in the Big 12. And then he just has moments where he literally looks like the worst quarterback in the Big 12, just makes terrible decisions at times. It's interesting, though, because they're going to test Baylor throwing the football a lot. I don't think their receivers are as good as Colorado's, but they're going to test you, and they're going to take shots downfield, and they have some really good ones. Jack Besh is phenomenal. He was a guy Baylor recruited pretty heavily, and probably kind of wish they had, because he has been really, really good for TCU this season. Outside of that, though, it's interesting because we just said Oklahoma State has BYU coming up on the road. Baylor has Texas Tech coming up on the road. TCU gets to go to Utah next. That's their next game. And so
and Cam Rising potentially is back for that game. Yeah.
Right. It's in 2 weeks because of the bye week. And so, I mean, all three of these teams are just in situations where it's like, man, schedule's not giving them any breaks with this game in which all of them really need a win. TCU then plays Texas Tech, and then they play Baylor. So that's kind of their upcoming schedule. So there's a chance that they're sitting there at 3-5, going into that game. We'll see on that. Maybe they're 4-4, but I think they're going to lose to Utah, and then maybe they'll beat Tech. But again, another situation. Baylor's going to be put in a good situation against a team that doesn't have a very good defense, not a very reliable one. I think that's come to pass. There were all these expectations about them because they do have talent on the defensive side, but it has not come together at all. And then offensively, again, just they can't run the ball and they turn the ball over too much. And those factors really, I don't think are going to play great on the road. But unfortunately, Baylor hasn't been great at forcing turnovers. So if you're not going to force turnovers, you're probably going to lose TCU. But you'll have opportunities to score the football at least.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at their FEI defense, ranked 90th after the most recent games, K4 defense 75th. And man, when you have that type of defense, you throw the ball a ton, and as you mentioned, you're turning it over a ton. Like Colorado can get away with it to an extent because Shore Sanders does not turn the football over. He just doesn't turn it over a lot. He has his moments where he does. I think maybe he's never thrown more than one interception in a game. Like in the Baylor game, like every throw he made, he was never putting the ball in risk. That's not TCU. They struggled to that. I actually think they're probably a better running team than they portray themselves to be. They just won't commit to doing it. And not because of depth, I don't really know. But every time they run, I'm like, why don't they run it more? And then they just get back to the passing game. And just that Sonny Dykes MO. I know Kendall Browse is the offensive coordinator, but that Sonny Dykes wants to throw the football. And maybe his fingerprints are a little bit on that, because if you look back at his time at Cal and SMU, he had some balance at times, but it always trended to let's throw it 60 times a game. And that's not Kendall Browse at his heart. And so I'm wondering if that's kind of Sonny Dykes saying, hey, let's throw it more. And it doesn't make sense to me, but it is what it is at this juncture. And that's costing them, because if they could run the ball when they get some of these leads that they have, if they could run it at all, they have more success.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And that's something that we'll see if they change that coming out of their bye week, if they're able to get back to that. Because I can't imagine they're going to be like, all right, we're just going to continue to watch Josh Hoover throw this ball 50 times and probably turn it over 3 times every time we play. That's a tough position to be put in. So they do need to run the ball to protect him and help this offense, I think, take that next step over the second half of the season.
Yeah, they have plenty of talent at receiver. They try to get it all involved. Former Bear Drake Dabney is there, and I don't know what his expectations were going to TCU this year, but his statistics compared to what he had at Baylor last year, I mean, I think he had, the last I saw, had like 4 catches on the season. But he is there, and he went there to win, and maybe they can get it turned around. So we'll see about that. Moving on, next opponent there'll be another bye week, which is nice to have 2 that late in the season, dividing up the last 3 games. And then they will travel to Morgantown to face West Virginia. West Virginia is a team I liked early. They have their deficiencies, but one thing we know is they're going to be able to run the football. They showed it against Oklahoma State. And defensively, they're not what I anticipated them being much better defensively. 62nd in FEI defense, 76 in K4 defense. You talked about the overall numbers before, but if they're going to win games later in the season, it's going to become because they can run the football with Garrett Green. And there was a scary moment for them against Oklahoma State where it looked like he was out. I mean, it didn't look good. It looked like a broken collarbone when I first saw it and the way he went out holding his shoulder. But then he comes back in. They continue to run the football and blow out Oklahoma State. So that can't be a game for Baylor where you do anything but say we're going to game plan to stop the run, make Garrett Green beat us through the air. He can do that, but it's like you can't be willing to give up 300 yards rushing in that game.
Right, and they're kind of one of those good offense, bad defense type teams. Yeah. And they are really bad defensively. Unfortunately, Baylor has never won in Morgantown. And I think just in general, when you kind of look at matchups, it doesn't seem great. Now, Baylor has played at times better on the road, so maybe they're able to go in there and maybe they get an 11 a.m. kickoff time instead of having to play another night game on the road. That would be probably pretty nice. But yeah, I think the important thing here that I'm looking at for West Virginia is currently they're 3-2. They have a very interesting schedule coming up before the Baylor game. They have Iowa State up next, then Kansas State, then at Arizona, and then a rivalry at Cincinnati before they play Baylor, and no bye week in between there. I'm not going to sit here and say, they're going to, lose all these games, but I do think they're probably going to lose at least 1 or maybe 2 during this stretch here. And, I think they'll have motivation because they need to make a bowl game for their head coach, I believe. And I think there is a path to that, but they do have a tough schedule. We're going to learn far more about them over these next few weeks. But I think in general, that's probably one that I won't be picking Baylor to win, at least not at this moment.
Yeah, I mean, those 4 games, and you talk about a coach that was on the hot seat last year before they won 9 games. Neil Brown, if he's 3-2 right now and goes on to lose against Iowa State at home, which is very possible. Iowa State's currently favored by 3, which is not a huge line considering this next weekend. But Iowa State, I think to me, after watching them, that's definitely the best overall team Baylor has faced this year. Offensively, the ability to run it, throw it, defensively. But if West Virginia does go, say, 1-3 in that stretch, where is Neil Brown in the hot seat? Like 0-4, could he? I mean, I don't want to say he gets fired at 0-4 in that stretch, but he was already on the hot seat at one point last year. So they could be coming to into that Baylor game with the mindset of, one, maybe they've made a change if they do go 0-4, or they're riding high. They could the range of possibilities for that game could just be absolutely nuts, because if they beat Iowa State at home, Kansas State at home, potentially Arizona on the road, and then win a rivalry game and go 4-0, the likelihood of Baylor being able to win that game goes down even more. Obviously, because they're how good they are, but they're just gonna be riding high. But the range of potentially going 0-4, they could do it. They could go either way in my mind, based on what they've done this year and based on what's on the schedule. The dynamics of that game, what I'm trying to say is that could change between now and then in a variety of different ways.
It definitely could. I think most realistic is they'll probably be 5-4 going into that Baylor game. And it'll be in Morgantown, and they'll be playing for a bowl bid. And so, I think that's one I'll probably pick Baylor to lose. I think that's a tough game. They're so balanced offensively, and they can hit you with explosive plays. And I don't know. It's just hard for me to envision Baylor winning that one. But again, that's a month away. That's over a month away. So we're gonna know more about these things.
There's a lot of things that could happen between now and then. Baylor currently has a 28.2% chance to win that game, which is the lowest of all their remaining games, according to ESPN's FBI. Moving on to Houston and Kansas. We've already talked about these of if you get into that portion of the season with bowl eligibility still possible, like you have to feel pretty good. And not because I think Willie Fritz is doing a good job at Houston, specifically on the defensive side of the ball. They're running the ball well. I would say they ran it better against Iowa State than Baylor did, obviously, but they still have their issues offensively. I think there's game planning, scheming wise, people are going to treat Houston differently than they even will Baylor because of their ability to throw with Sawyer Robertson. So they go and beat TCU. But man, Baylor traveling to this game at Houston, Baylor fans, if there's a possibility of a bowl game, show up to that game. You have an easy drive to get there. But Baylor's defense should, in my mind, have an advantage in this game to get them the win. I just don't see it from Houston's passing offense, and a TCU, for whatever reason, struggled against them so much even in the past game. And I know that they did start a different quarterback than they have been starting this year, and maybe that spurs them on. Maybe that's what is the ultimate change for Houston offensively. But if you take away their run at this point in the season, like that's kind of what they're going to do. So you got to figure out a way to take that away. And if you're anywhere close, if you're 4-6 at that juncture, if you lose this game, that's just absolutely devastating.
Right. And I mean, we can point to a lot of different things, but in general, Houston has scored less than 12 points in 4 games. They've been shut out twice. They're not good offensively.
Cincinnati, yeah.
Right. And they don't have, yes, they made the change at quarterback. That could help them. I would also say their 30 points against TCU was largely because TCU just kept turning the ball over. I mean, They won the turnover margin 4-0 and still only scored 30 points. I mean, I don't know. I'm not super impressed. I did like the change they made at quarterback, though. Much more dynamic of a runner with Zion. I think he will help them, but we'll see on that. So the thing with them, though, is their schedule is awful. I mean, this is, I don't know who made this schedule for them, but it is really tough. They go to Lawrence to face Kansas in a must win for Kansas. Kansas has to win that game. Then they get Utah in Houston. Then they get Kansas State in Houston. Then they go on the road to Arizona. I mean, I'm not picking them to win any of those games. And then they play Baylor, and then they get at BYU at the end of the year. It's just, it seems really tough. And just kind of looking at their schedule, I'd be surprised if they had more than 3 wins going into that Baylor game, which means they would be out of bowl eligibility, or they wouldn't have a chance at a bowl. And so again, what are you playing for? And that's a game where Baylor could be playing for a lot against a not great team. Yeah, the worst team in the Big 12 according to the metrics.
Yeah, so they defensively is their strength, 47th K4 defense efficiency, FEI 44. And if you look at that, it's actually Baylor faces the 82nd, 70th, 75th, 76th, 47th, which is Houston, and then 72nd ranked defenses. So this is the toughest defense at this juncture that they'll face for the rest of the season. I think some of that's kind of game planning from the other teams of what they can do. Do you take the foot off the gas? Iowa State, to an extent, did that. They still attempted a few things, but if you get out ahead of them, it's going to be tough for them to catch up. And that's a favorable matchup for Baylor because I think it kind of matches up weakness versus strength for Baylor. And then Baylor's offense has come along to the point you feel pretty good about them scoring points. I mean, putting up 21 at Iowa State, putting up 28 against BYU at this point are both actually pretty impressive performances by Baylor's offense. And then obviously you saw them score the 31 points against Colorado, some of that on special teams. But I mean, a must-win game if you get to that point of the season and a bowl is within reach. I memean, if you're looking for number 6 in that particular game, I mean, best case scenario in my mind, dude, like Baylor fans, you better be in Houston. Like you better be there. There's going to be a lot of tickets available for that game. And that leads into the Kansas game, another opportunity to get a win. I think Kansas is better than their record, but they're struggling in 1-score games. How does the team react to this after such high expectations? Jalen Daniels has been kind of a turnover machine. The passing game has fallen off so much with them. You worry the run game still can be very good for Kansas. But then in general, defensively, not great. They've struggled in a lot of different spots. I mean, you go back to the UNLV game and everything that happened there to begin the season, and it's just kind of continued. I never expected Kansas to continue at the trajectory they were. They were always going to have a step back at some point. I didn't anticipate it under Lance Leipold being 1-5 and basically saying in a worse situation that Baylor was for this particular season. That just never crossed my mind as a possibility.
I agree with you. I think I had Kansas 7-5 at the beginning of the year, which was actually lower than their win total. I think it was like 8.5 was their win total. So they are severely underperforming. And again, I keep going through these schedules because I think as you get to the end of the year, it's important to kind of see where teams are at. I do not see any world where Kansas is fighting for bowl eligibility in that game against Baylor. They still have to play at Kansas State, Iowa State, in Lawrence, at BYU. They're losing at least two of those. And that's going to get you to 1-7 if you say, oh, I think they can win those. The other games they have are Houston and Colorado. So if they just stumble in one of those, they'll have 7 losses going into the Baylor game. And so what's your motivation? Once again, what's the motivation there for them? And again, that puts Baylor in a potentially favorable spot against a team that doesn't have a good defense. I do think their defense has actually been stronger than their offense because their offense keeps turning the ball over and keeps making just costly errors that puts their defense in terrible positions. And so that's kind of the interesting part. You also have the Jeff Grimes part coming back to Waco to face Baylor. He's going to have a bit of an edge and a chip on his shoulder there as well. So there's a lot of kind of storylines going into that game. But again, it sets up fairly well for Baylor if again, the Bears can at least get to 5 wins at that point.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be the key is, and I think that's kind of been the MO for this entire season for Dave Aranda specifically. It's like, can you get through the season with the team remaining competitive and remaining focused? Because like you saw that through those 2 games. I mean, Baylor had their ups and downs, but against Colorado, against BYU, it's like those are competitive games. Even after the bad start against BYU, that was a 28-14 game. Basically, at half, BYU kicks a late field goal, but it was within reach. But then that's why it's so frustrating to see the end of the Iowa State game. It's like they weren't competitive at all at the final quarter and a half. Can they bounce back now against Texas Tech? I think there's the chance for that. That's going to lessen their challenges are going to lessen a little bit for their offense to the defensive standpoint with their upcoming opponents. But Dave Aranda has to keep this team engaged because just like all these other teams, if you go out and you're like, you get crushed by Tech, I don't know what the line's going to be in that game. I know Tech will be favored. But if you go out and get crushed by Tech and then you come home and against Oklahoma State and you feel like this is like the drop dead, you got to win this game, like all that pressure mounts and then you lose it. Like, I don't know if you can go into those last 4 games and expecting to go undefeated and win all 4 of them. And it just sets the precedent of like, we already kind of know what the team we are. And now we got to go and say we have to exceed what we already have shown on the field. Baylor needs those wins, and you don't want to have to be up against the wall knowing we have to win the last 4 games of the season. Like Baylor, absolutely, in my mind, Tech is not a must win. I think the must win for me is one of the next 2, and then figure it out from there. Those are going to be the games that kind of the swing points of the season. Not only because it's you're going from potentially 2-5. But then you're talking 2-6, and you have to win out and go 4-0 in the last 4 games. So it's pivotal. I mean, it's coming up, but it's there for them. I think if they can play to their ability level and what they have shown, not the last quarter and a half against Iowa State, the offense continues to chug along. I think the run game is going to have an opportunity to pick up a little bit. The last 2 weeks have not been the opportunity against BYU and Iowa State to necessarily expose that. And now they have a bye week to get healthy. I think there's some spots they need to get healthy in, specifically at running back with Dom Richardson out last week and then Bryson Washington apparently getting a concussion in that game against Iowa State. Great opportunity for a bye week that sets Baylor up for the last 6 games of the season and potentially Dave Aranda's tenure at Baylor.
Right. And I think it's also important to mention that, I'm not going to say every game means the same, but these next 3 games mean more to the Baylor fan base and mean more to alumni and mean more to anyone. I mean, these are the games that matter. These are the rivalry games that you got to find ways to win. These are who you're recruiting against. These are direct competitors that you got to find a way to win. You got 2 of them at home. If you go 2-1 during this stretch, I think that's solid. That can set you up to end up making a bowl game, but you got to be competitive and you got to show that you're improving because you get Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, TCU. These are kind of your peers in the conference and the guys that compete against you the most when it comes to recruiting and a lot on the field as well, as all of them have Big 12 title hopes in the future. Probably not this year. Maybe Tech feels like they do. I don't believe they do, but these are programs that are trying to get to that point.
Yeah. I mean, it sets up for Dave Aranda to make a statement. I think it's the best way to put it. Like, if you're coming back, this is opportunity. If you get back in this stretch, if you get right in this stretch, this is a great stretch to get right in. I mean, Tech,
Hmm.
Oklahoma State, TCU, West Virginia, Houston, and Kansas are one thing at the end of the season if they can get you bowl eligible.
Yeah.
But people will remember these games, especially specifically against TCU because of the lopsidedness in that particular rivalry. So, all right, Baylor family, that's going to do it for this episode of Inside Baylor Sports. As always, thanks to each of you for listening. Any Big 12 fans tuning in, appreciate you listening. Please give your comments and feedback in the comments on YouTube, or send us a message on DM or a DM on Twitter or X. For Grayson Grunhafer, I'm Colt Barber. Have a great Tuesday, and sick 'em Bears.